So while traveling during my sabbatical, I was reminded of something. And I'm going to tell you what I was reminded of here in a moment. But on this time that we spent away, we went through a lot of the western part of the United States. We drove through Wisconsin and ended up in South Dakota, and there we saw Badlands National Park. We spent time going through Wyoming, down into Colorado, and we spent time in Estes Park, which is basically the Gatlinburg of Colorado. And while we were in Estes Park, we were able to go to the Rocky Mountain National Park. If you've never been there, it's basically, the thing to do there is to drive through the Rocky Mountains on the highest altitude paved road, I think maybe in anywhere in the world, but for sure in the United States. And then we went to Denver. In Denver, we went to the zoo, we went to the aquarium, we went to the Museum for Nature and Science. And also, while we were in Denver, we went further south to Colorado Springs. And in Colorado Springs, we went to a place called Garden of the Gods. If you've never been there, it's a really beautiful little spot in Colorado Springs. And then we went from Denver or Colorado and swung through Albuquerque, Texas, and then we stopped in Tulsa and St. Louis as we came home. So we went to a lot of different states. And so if you've been to some of those states, you know that we've been through a lot of different geography. A lot of different, I don't know the proper word, but different climates and temperate zones. I don't know the word. I can't remember what it's called anymore. But the different types of climates that are even in the United States. And what I was reminded of is this, that nothing beats the geography of Indiana. And I mean that. I remember when we lived in Denver, I felt this way. Denver, the city of Denver, they do have trees like we have here. But this is the thing, those trees are very stressed because trees don't grow there unless you plant them and water them like crazy, which they do. They water those trees, they water the lawns like crazy out there because otherwise everything would be dead because Denver is basically a desert. It's basically as arid as a desert. Same with Albuquerque, same with Wyoming, all these places, no trees. But when you're here in Indiana, we have the hardwood forest of the eastern United States. And I believe that that is the best geography anywhere in our country. So let's think about these hardwood trees because there's something about them that's unique and you don't really appreciate it unless you spend time away from here. We're so used to looking out everywhere and seeing hardwoods, seeing all these trees that we're used to, knowing that if you just don't do anything to a plot of land for long enough, that it's going to have a bunch of those trees because it's just what happens here. These trees, they have the center. So what is the center of a tree? Well, it's the first thing that comes out of the ground when it's a sapling. It's the thing that delivers water and nutrients to all the branches. It's the trunk, right? That's the center of the tree. It's arguably the most important part. I mean, obviously, the roots are important, but the trunk is what holds it up. It's what gives the water nutrients to all of the tree. It's the center of it. Now, what is the center of life? So think about the trunk is the center of a tree. What's the trunk of life? And not just our life, but all of life and all of the universe. What is that center? This is what we get to explore today. We get to explore the center of life. So you take out your Bibles and turn to Colossians. We're going to continue in this letter written by Paul and Timothy. It's Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23. So in the Pew Bible, that is page number 1676. So Colossians right here. So Colossians chapter 1, and we'll be doing verses 15 through 23. So let's take a look at this passage together. So Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. This is how it opens. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Now, if you're here last week, we started this letter called Colossians. The first thing we need to remember, it is a letter. It was written by Paul and Timothy. When you read the letter, the very first thing in this opening introduction, as they call it, was the people who write the letter. The senders put their names first, Paul and Timothy. And then they put the recipients, and it's the church of the Colossian people who are the members of the church in this city called Colossae. And then there's a greeting. Now, the greeting is just like how we do dear so-and-so. They had a greeting. And then after the greeting, for Paul, his letters almost always, I think there's only one case where this isn't the case, only one letter where he doesn't have a prayer. He always prays for the people he's writing to. And in Colossians, there's a prayer. We looked at that prayer last week. It started as a thanksgiving, Paul giving thanks for the Colossians. Then it transitioned into him praying for them. And then we get to the part we're at now. Now, scholars like to call this a digression. That's really what they call it. So if anybody has that family member or friend who, no matter what you're talking about, no matter what conversation you're trying to have, you mention one word and all of a sudden they're off sideways. And about 15 minutes later, you're like, this isn't what we're talking about. Why were we ever talking about this? Now, I am guilty of this sometimes. So maybe some of you have experienced that with me. And I know that. And I try to control it. But sometimes it's irresistible to go down that road. So that's what the scholars always used to say about Paul. He'd be sitting there and he'd be writing a letter, and then all of a sudden he would say something and his mind would go a different direction. And then all of a sudden, 2 chapters later, he's going somewhere else than he planned. That was what they always thought. Because this section here is about Jesus. So in verse 13, he mentions Jesus, and then they think that because of that, he goes on a 9-verse digression. That's what, if you read scholars, that's what they say. But here's the problem with that. The more we've learned about how letters were written in the first century, I've already told you that Paul and Timothy wrote this together. Also, we think that letters were written over a period of time where they were carefully planned because it was expensive to write a letter. You had to buy the paper. You had to find somebody to take it for you. You had to pay somebody to write it. Because yes, maybe you could write and maybe you could form sentences, but maybe your writing wasn't the best. And you wanted to pay somebody who could get the most on that piece of paper that you're paying for. So I think that Paul and Timothy were intentional to bring up Jesus in this section, in the middle of this prayer. So what this means is we need to pay close attention to why he mentions Jesus, because this is going to help us enter into what the letter's all about. So what he says about Jesus in this verse is, the Son is the image of the invisible God, and he's the firstborn over all creation. So the image of the invisible God, this is Paul grabbing onto a Jewish idea. The Jewish people had a concept of the invisible God becoming visible. The first way that happened was humans. We are made in the image of God. In some way, we are a visible representation of God in the world. But more than that, when God would visit humans, because we are physical, he would visit us, and there's a couple different ways in the Old Testament this happens. There's the angel of the Lord. Sometimes it's just this human-like figure. And in one place, there's someone called the Son of Man, who's described like a human, but has this role that seems to be like God's role. And so Paul is grabbing onto that and saying Jesus is the image of the invisible God that we've been hearing about so much. So that should clue us into something important about Jesus. And he's the firstborn of creation. Now, does that mean he's the firstborn son, as in like the firstborn something of God? Now, we don't want to say that because we don't think Jesus was ever created or born. Our creeds very carefully say not that. They're very careful to not use the language of creation for Jesus. But there's another way that firstborns came into, they were important in the Jewish world. In the Jewish world, the firstborn son had a double portion of inheritance compared to the rest of the family. But the reason for that was because the firstborn son became the responsible member of the family once the father passed. The firstborn son became the head of the family. This person had to take over all the affairs for the family, had to negotiate on behalf of the family, had to represent the family in the community. So the firstborn son had a special status. And this is, we think, what Paul's saying about Jesus. He has this unique status in creation. So what does this mean exactly? Well, it means that Jesus is in some way unique. He's the image of the invisible God, meaning if we want to see God, we look to Jesus. And he's the firstborn of creation, which means he has this special status. The question we need to ask is, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, let's keep going, and we'll see what Paul says. Verse 16, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So now Paul goes further. in Timothy. In Jesus and through Jesus and for Jesus, all things have been made. So now Paul's taking Jesus to the next level. He's not just the image of the invisible God, which humans in some sense also are that. He's not just the firstborn of creation, so maybe the first among all humans. He's been elevated to a status where he's part of creation in some way. Now, also in the Hebrew Bible, another way they would talk about God and God's ability to interact with the world was through wisdom. And there's a couple places in the Psalms and in Proverbs where wisdom is identified as the way through which God created the world. And now Paul is making a connection with Jesus. Jesus is actually that one who was there at creation. It's in him and through him that all things were made, and for him. So in some way, Jesus has always been central to the story of not just our existence, but of the universe. So we're thinking about that trunk. What is the center of the universe? Well, in some way, Jesus has always been there since the beginning. So this is cluing us into something about Jesus that's very important, and something that Paul is going to come back to later in the letter as he talks to these people in this city called Colossae, where they have all of these gods and all of these competing ideas coming at them. And Paul says, remember, Jesus is most important. That's what he's saying to us today. Jesus is most important. Because in some way, Jesus is at the beginning and central to the world. Let's see what he says next. Verse 17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So here, Paul's just basically restating what he said before. A little conclusion to say, yes, Jesus was there from the beginning. All things were there through him, and he holds all things together. So we've learned the first thing important about Jesus is that he's been there since the beginning. He's in some way central to life. Now let's see what Paul says next. Verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. So now Paul transitions because he's talking to a community of Jesus followers called an ecclesia, which the ecclesia in the Roman world was just a gathering of citizens. And now we have a gathering of people who are committed to Jesus. And Paul says, yes, he is the head of your gathering. There's this transition. It's not just that Jesus is a part of the world from creation, but now he's very central to the life of this church, of the Colossian church. Also, he's the firstborn from among the dead. Remember, the message of the church is about being rescued from death. And Jesus is the beginning of that rescue from death. And because of all of this, he is the one who might have supremacy, which is kind of a weird phrase, and it is a weird phrase. But what this is basically trying to communicate to us, Jesus has done these things, so he is first. So again, Paul's trying to say something about human life. What's central to life? What should be the center of our life? And the answer is Jesus. Let's keep going with verse 19. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. So again, going back to the Old Testament, God's presence used to dwell in the tabernacle, then it dwelled in the temple, and now it dwells in Jesus. So not only is he the image of the invisible God, but God dwells fully in Jesus. So this is basically one of the strongest claims that can be made about Jesus, to say that he is God. When we look at Jesus, when we think of Jesus, when we read about him and try to follow him, we're following God. And we're encountering God. Why should he be so central to our lives? And why is he so central to all of life? Because Jesus is God. He is God. And that's what Paul's reminding the Colossians. This is who you follow. This is who you're committed to. This is who you're striving to be like. And then he says this, for God was pleased to have all this fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And so now Paul goes to what Jesus did. It's through Jesus that humans were reconnected to God. That's what reconcile is all about. It's about people who were enemies becoming friends. It's about humans and God being at odds and being brought back together. And it was through Jesus that happened. It was because of Jesus' sacrifice that we were able to be made whole with God again. And so this story is about God doing away with the chaos of sin. Think all the way back to the beginning. God creates the world good with order and purpose. Humans rebel and they reintroduce chaos and evil and destruction. And then God's remaking the world through Jesus. And that's what he wants to do. So Jesus is not just the center of the creation of the world, but he's central to the recreation or the restoration of the world. He creates the world, but he restores the world. So he's central to the beginning, and he's central to what's going on right now in all of our lives and in the world as God remakes the world. So this is the relationship we have with Jesus. He's right in the middle of everything, trying to make the world whole again. So he's the beginning and he's in the middle. But what about the end of our lives? Verse 21. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of evil or your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. So now there's this transition. Paul again talks to the Colossians. He says, remember, you used to be separated from God. You used to be on one side and God was somewhere else. But through Jesus, you've been brought together again. This is going to be important later in the letter. It's important for us too because we've been reconciled to God. We were enemies and now we're not. We were alienated enemies. But here's the reality of life, and I think all of us understand this. There's always that pull. There's always that pull away from God, away from the way of Jesus. And Paul knew that. He knew that the Colossians are living in this difficult culture where following Jesus is not the norm, is not accepted. In some ways, it means you're alienated from your family, from your profession. And he's saying, I want you to remain faithful. Look how he starts verse 23. If you continue in your faith, remaining faithful, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that was been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, in of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Paul knew that the challenge for the Colossians was getting pulled away. He knew it wasn't accepting Jesus. He knew the challenge was remaining faithful to Jesus. And that's why he says, remember who is central to life. Remember and remain faithful. And that's what this letter is going to be about. It's going to be about remaining faithful to Jesus. And so right here at the beginning, he reminds the Colossian people just how important Jesus is. He reminds them that Jesus is the beginning, middle, and end of your life with God. He's the beginning because he was there at creation. He's in the middle because he's right there in the middle of helping you reconnect with God. And he's at the end because if you remain faithful to him, that's when your life is connected with God at his return. It's easy to get off track. And Paul knows that. And that's why he says we need to remain faithful. So last week we talked about the good life. We talked about, well, what is the life that we're supposed to live? And we said that the root of the life we're supposed to live, the foundation of it, is the way of Jesus. But we might ask ourselves, well, why should we be so committed to Jesus? And right here, Paul's telling us why. We're committed to Jesus because Jesus is the beginning, middle, and end of our life with God. This is why it's so crucial that we remain faithful. We can't become complacent. Complacency is an automatic step away. Every single day, vigilant commitment. Get up. I am giving my life to the way of Jesus. Every day. Every day. From the first thing we think about to the last thing we think about, committed to Jesus. Because when we start to become complacent, that's when we can slide back into the darkness and into the evil of the world. And later in the letter here, Paul is going to be talking about those powers and the people, both spiritual powers and also human physical powers that are trying to pull us away from Jesus. And what Paul says is, remember, Jesus was there at the beginning, and he was the one who created those things too. Because Jesus is there at the beginning. It's through him that all things are made. He was there at the middle because through him we're able to be remade. And he's there at the end because we must remain faithful to him for all of our lives. Jesus is the beginning, middle, and end of our life with God. This is what Colossians is about. It's about learning to remain connected to Jesus. And here's what we need to learn. When we remain connected to Jesus, that's when we live the good life. That's when we live the life we were made to live. That's when we flourish. Jesus is the beginning, middle, and end of our life with God. So may we pursue him and may we find life.